The Education of OverSoul7 by Jane Roberts. Read by Martin John. Chapter 6. Joseph's Second Dream. Joseph felt alone, as if his soul had left him, or as if part of his soul had been in the painting that he'd just destroyed. He hadn't the heart to look at it again. One glimpse of the smeared top coating of glaze had been enough. In portions, the paint had been gooed out right down to the bare canvas. Memory of the painting's initial, almost blinding inspiration rose up to mock him. He hadn't lived up to it, of course. The one great inspiration of his life, and he'd ruined it in a fit of anger. Or had it been flawed beyond repair even before he destroyed it? Had he known all along that he'd never been able to paint the masterpiece that he saw so vividly in his mind? Joseph didn't like to examine his feelings. He just liked to give in to them, or paint them. Self-examination made him nervous. Yet these thoughts kept returning as he grappled with quite unpleasant practical considerations. He had to get out of there as quickly as possible. Jonathan would give him the beating of his life, and with the painting gone, he had nothing to bargain with. He could fight Jonathan if he had to. They were about the same size. But Jonathan would be self-righteous about it, furious, and he'd just be out to protect himself. So it had come to this. Grumbling, he gathered his gear together, the dry pigments, jars of oil and varnish, brushes, 3 rolled canvases. Feeling sorrier for himself each minute, he stacked the stuff by the door and looked out of the window at the snowy plains and low hills. There were occasional farmhouses where he could stop. If it was only summer, he thought, when he could do sketches at town festivals, flatter the ladies in the marketplace, then there was no trouble finding a place to stay. But it was winter, and he'd spoiled his nest. He flopped down on the bed, eyeing the bundle of belongings. Now he saw it all differently. He hadn't been kicked out yet. Why should he put himself out in the middle of winter? Maybe he could save himself. Maybe he could think up a good enough story. Maybe... Briefly, the face of Ivana Hosenthoff came into his mind. She was particularly taken with the damned painting. Her face when she saw it would be a study in rage. But it was all too much. Joseph fell into an exhausted sleep, tossing fitfully, expecting the Hosenthoff force to be upon him at any moment. When he awakened, it was past midnight, and the house was still. Hardly believing his good fortune, he got up quietly and opened the window. The Hosenthoffs must have returned late and gone to bed, he thought. Holding his breath, grinning at his own craftiness, Joseph threw his gear out the window, well into the snow. He didn't dare use the stairs. They creaked. Instead, he went to the other window and cautiously dropped down the few feet to the shed roof. It was below 0. but now the cold air was exciting and added to his sudden mood of exuberance. As he leaped to the ground, he thought of the Hosenthoffs' impotent rage when they found him gone, the painting ruined. With good luck, they'd never discover his escape until morning, giving him at least a good head start. And why should they follow him? They'd just yell and sputter instead. They knew he had no way of paying them back for his room and board, even if they did take all the trouble to track him down. He attached his skis, threw his knapsack over his shoulders, and started off. At first it was pleasant in all that quiet night snow, but he'd forgotten how heavy his gear was. And after being inside all winter, the unaccustomed cold began to annoy him, then upset him, until finally it was all he could think about. He wasn't that good a skier either. He felt bulkier than usual, which he was. He'd worn all his clothes, 3 sweaters, 2 pair of pants, and 2 sets of underwear. And now his body itched and sweated inside, while his face felt frozen to the bone. But it was worth it, he thought, trying to regain his earlier cheerfulness. The end of an era, saved again. They caught up with him near morning. He'd stopped to rest in the early dawn, when he saw the horse-driven sleigh approaching, and heard the stupid ringing of the little bells, and felt that awful hard lump in the pit of his stomach. They'd be on him in no time. There was no place to hide, and they'd seen him already. He could tell by the vicious intent sent to Jonathan's head and shoulders as he drove the sled. There was no mistaking that obstinate outline. The fates were after him, chasing him in the figures of Elgrin and Jonathan, and the other 2 sat behind. Probably Elgin's brothers, Joseph thought. To his own surprise, he just felt transfixed, unable to move, or to do anything but watch their approach. The sleigh drew ever closer, its gray outlines taking on definite shape, the red color getting brighter and brighter, more and more real. He felt as if the whole thing, sled, horses, and riders, rode from some nightmare place in his own mind, out here to pursue him. On the other hand, it seemed they'd always chased him. The pursuit would never let up, and the moment would never end. Why did they bother? He wondered, with a mild astonishment that didn't even begin to touch his panic. Revenge? Why else? But already the stocky figure of Jonathan leapt into life, jumped from the sled with his father right after, followed by the 2 others from the back seat. All at once they were at him. They had ropes which they threw about his body, pinning down his arms. "Ah!" Jonathan kept shouting. "You brigand! Thief! Ah! More rope! Tie him up good!" The sight of rope made Joseph really crazy. He suddenly began kicking, yelling, biting. They threw him down and took his skis off and tossed him in the back of the sled. Eldrin's brothers, both big, usually good-hearted men, were laughing now. They thought it was one big joke. Between them, all trussed up, Joseph glared. Jonathan was swearing steadily from the front seat, and his father, Elgrin, kept grunting, "Yes, yes." During the entire trip, they amused themselves by pretending to consider the most gory of revenges all the while assuring him that he needn't worry. His fate was already settled, with a punishment most fitted to his crime. Joseph pretended not to hear a word. What did they really have in store for him? Joseph closed his eyes and tried not to think about it. Did they know about him and Bianca? He wondered desperately. The suspense made him dizzier than the sled's motion, which unaccountably had now begun to bother him. Finally the trip was over. Shouting triumphantly, they dragged him off the sled, up the steps, and into the kitchen where Bianca and her mother and the two smaller boys stood, pointing, giggling, in a great mood. They whisked him through, pushing him upstairs, and threw him in his room. Jonathan shoved him over to the bed. "We've decided what to do with you, famous artist," Jonathan said. His round head bobbed. He wet his lips. His gray eyes sparkled. He put his hands on his stocky hips. "Haven't we, everybody?" "Yes," came the shouts from outside the door where the rest of the family gathered, peeking in from the top of the stairs. "We are putting you in jail. It's too much trouble to take you to town and swear warrants. Good farmers like us can't take all that time. So this room is your jail." Nods and shouts all around. Joseph squirmed underneath the ropes and glowered. "You're going to do us a painting, as you promised. And you don't get fed unless you do. Every day one of us will come up with some food. And if you aren't working on a painting that takes our fancy, well then, you'll just get lighter and lighter and thinner. Bianca poked her mother and laughed. Elgrin stepped to the front. "It's only fair. A bargain is a bargain. You don't leave this room, no matter how long it takes, until we get a decent painting. My wife, here, wants a painting of the farmhouse, just like it was. She had her heart set on it, and that's what she's going to get." "I can't just copy one painting over," Joseph yelled. "You can never get one painting just like another." "You better learn how, then," Ovnova said, coming forward, shaking her apron in his face. "Thought you got away with it, didn't you? You never had any intention of finishing that painting. And if poor Bianca hadn't felt ill last night and couldn't sleep, she never would have been up so late and looked out to see your tracks reaching out there in the snow." Bianca lowered her eyes. Joseph could have killed her. "And we're boarding up the windows to make it more like a real jail," Jonathan said. "Then you'll work harder to get out of here. When you've given us a picture we like for all the good food you ate, then we'll let you go your way." "You just can't keep me a prisoner that way," Joseph managed to say. "Why, it's immoral. I won't be able to paint all locked up. And I need light to begin with. You can't board up the windows." At first he was just relieved. He was alive, after all. But loneliness and isolation would be unbearable, he realized. They picked the one thing most likely to drive him out of his mind. He'd escape somehow, he told himself, as he stared up at their flushed, triumphant faces. But that afternoon they boarded up the windows. There was no food that entire day or night, and he couldn't paint. They left lanterns, but he just sat there in the gloomy darkness without lighting them. He couldn't sleep. Finally, he just paced the room, angrier and angrier, and banged on the door in the middle of the night. He'd drive them crazy with all his noise at least, but no one paid the slightest attention. He wore himself out, slamming his body against the door, shouting, throwing furniture. Disgusted, he realized that nothing would work. "They mean what they said," he said aloud wonderingly. He hadn't really believed them, but a bargain was a bargain to Eldrin and Jonathan. It was as simple as that. If he showed signs of real starvation, they'd probably just send the women to relatives so that his condition didn't weaken their resolve. Prickles of panicky sweat broke out on his face, trickling into his mustache. He didn't even know if he could produce a decent painting now to begin with. Being forced to work would just make things worse. If he couldn't make himself work, how could anything else? He glowered at the boarded windows. Hosenthoff really meant to lock him up for good, to starve him if necessary. He could hardly believe it, he thought again. He'd never hurt anyone in his life. To begin with, how had they taken him so seriously? His thoughts wavered. Once he felt his teeth crunch down into an apple. With great gusto, he bit into the crisp skin. It split with a popping sound. Cursing, he sat up and looked about the room, which now had an ominous, waiting air that made him pull the blankets up to his chin. In the morning, Jonathan and Eldrin came up together. They glanced about. "No work, no food," Jonathan said. "The atmosphere isn't exactly inspiring," Joseph yelled from the bed, but the two marched out without another word, locking the door behind them. "I'll die of starvation before I lift a brush to do a painting for you," Joseph shouted. No one answered. There was no one to talk with. He drank the water they were big-hearted enough to leave in the pitcher, but he was getting dizzy from lack of food. The next day he just lay on the bed, brooding, and watching the few shafts of light that fell through the crevices in the boarded windows. A twilight cast filled the room. He felt lethargic. He'd almost convinced himself that Bianca would certainly sneak up with some food for him, when he began to doze. The next thing he knew, he was dreaming. Then the dream itself shuddered, split open. The air shimmered. He was staring at his double, who looked down at him, mustache bristling, eyes warm and oddly understanding. "What are you doing here?" Joseph said. "You're another me. I'm dreaming again. One of me gets in enough trouble. I certainly don't need two." "I thought your own image would be reassuring," OverSoul7 said. "Reassuring? That's how little you know," Joseph shouted. He turned his head to the wall. All right, OverSoul7 said, hurt. He changed into the image of the wise old man. "Is this better?" "Turn around so you can see me," he said. "Thank heaven. Now you're somebody I can trust," Joseph said. "Where have you been? I haven't seen you in my dreams at all lately." "I've been very busy," Seven said. For that matter, I probably shouldn't even be here. But I always relate to you. More and more, you remind me of myself. Except that you get in such trouble all the time. And it's always needless. You could so easily avoid it. This time you've really done it. Hosentofs won't let you out either, unless you produce. You've roused their sense of virtue. They're going to teach you a lesson, even if you die of starvation. Am I dreaming? Yes and no. You're sleeping? I'm really here, if that's what you mean, but I'm not staying. You can't just go away and leave me, Joseph pleaded. I haven't had anyone to talk to for days. I'll go crazy if I haven't already. You've got to help me. I gave you the idea for that painting. And what did you do? Ruin it. You must like trouble, Seven said, fading out. You can't go. I won't have it, Joseph cried. If you have to go, take me with you. In utter astonishment at the suggestion, Seven rematerialized. He debated. It's not sensible. It's not at all wise, he said. You aren't even resourceful like Maha or Proteus or Lydia. And I can't trust a word you say because you change your mind all the time. You'll take me? Joseph asked. I'll take you, Seven said, sighing. Only because something in me always worries about you, though. But you've got to do what I say, and you probably won't remember much when you wake up. If you were awake in your terms, then you wouldn't have asked the question. What question? Joseph asked. Never mind. Look around the room and tell me what you see. Joseph shrugged. A chair, easel, windows, and a funny yellow monkey. The monkey isn't really there. You're hallucinating it, Seven said. Make it go away, or you'll just get all confused. Make it go away? Joseph asked. Do you have a monkey in your room ordinarily? Seven asked, as if he were speaking to a slow learner. No. Then it shouldn't be here now. It's a dream element. Tell it to disappear, or I'm going without you. Go away, Joseph said to the monkey, and it just disappeared. Joseph stared. A sense of power made him smile brightly. What about you? He said. Suppose I make you go away. Then what will you do? Seven asked. I see what you mean. What's next? Well, Seven said, I'm not too happy at the thought of dragging you along, but there's someone I have to look in on before I go back. Proteus. Never mind. Just follow me and don't look back at the bed. Here, we'll do it in the easy way. Take my hand. As soon as Joseph did, the two of them began to rise in the air. Joseph's consciousness blinked out for a moment, as Seven thought it probably would. Unconscious, Joseph was much more reasonable and easier to handle. Cypress watched Seven as he toted Joseph along, but she just smiled to herself and made no attempt to contact him. His technique, she decided, was anything but unobtrusive. End of chapter 6. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.